And then Chloe, if you just want to jump in and say, and I'm Chloe, and then we can go from there.
Or Cleo, which is your actual
Cleo,
name.
not Chloe. Sorry.
That's fine. I get it all the time.
I feel like, that's like worse than getting the wrong pronouns and stuff like that. I've just literally given you a new name. That's the white patriarchy right there for you. Okay. Hey, welcome to Beer Christianity. My name's Jonty.
I'm Laura.
I'm Malky.
And I'm Cleo.
Cleo,
Yay.
welcome. Yay, hey, we got that right. That was all like very smooth after I misnamed you earlier, which is, great. That's the one thing they tell you.
Good way to kick off this
really
episode.
Great way to kick off. Cleo, do you want to tell us a little bit about where you are from in terms of working and who you are?
Yeah, absolutely. So I am from Gendered Intelligence. So we are the UK's largest trans-led charity, and we work to support and improve the lives of the trans community in the UK. We've got our fingers in quite a lot of pies, but I suppose mainly we do youth work. So that's creating spaces for young trans people, doing sports activities. We also do education and outreach in workplaces and organizations. And then we do public engagement, which is what I do and why I get to come on fun podcasts like this one. I live in Norwich in the UK, where I originally was in academia before I went into the third sector. I've been here about 15 years now. It's a beautiful city.
And your academic background, can you tell us a little bit about that? What was your focus?
Yeah, absolutely. So I was at the University of East Anglia in Norwich. I mean, I technically still am. I still teach there to sort of keep my oar in. But what I'm teaching at the moment is medical humanities, sort of the sociology of medicine. But that's quite a long way from where I started out, which was initially creative writing. And then I found my way into a course that was called Medieval and Early Modern Textual Cultures, but is sort of old shit over a pretty long period, writ more straightforwardly. And I think that's where my passion is in history and specifically what gets left out of history.
Fantastic. And then we're going to touch on that a little bit later. One of the things that we really want to talk about and wanted to explore in this episode is something that gendered intelligence does speak into and help out a little bit with as well, which is the kind of the world of sports and athletes and the sporting world. What does that engagement usually look like?
So I would say a lot of it is around our youth work. So trans young people all around the world, but specifically in the UK, are overwhelmingly less likely than their peers to have access to sport and physical activity. And that extends, that starts really young. It starts with exclusion in school, in sort of peer groups. And it's not something that has to happen. It's not like, despite what lots of the gay people in my circle might say, it's not like it's not like we're naturally indisposed towards sports, But there's so much pressure at the moment in the UK to exclude trans people from things like changing rooms, sports clubs, any kind of sort of organized or competitive sport, that it is starting to happen to young people in schools who are sort of, just trying to get into this casually. And so we do things like swimming groups for young people. We do residential camps, which have all sorts of outdoor activities that a lot of these young people aren't getting elsewhere in their lives. And I think one of the reasons it's so important to be able to create like a positive engagement with sport and physical activity for queer young people is that, partially it's like fun. It's a really important part of life. You make friends, you learn skills, but also regular access to physical activity is a really key indicator of physical and mental health as you get older. And we can see, and this is also true of people from lower income families, of sort of first and second generation migrant families, of people of color, wherever there is less good access to physical activity, there's a significantly higher rate of physical and mental illness later in life. And so it's not just an equality thing, though that is, of course, important. It's a quality of life thing. And outside of our youth work, we do some education and policy work around sport. We recently worked with the Northern Irish Human Rights Campaign. We recently worked with them to develop some guidelines to promote the inclusion of trans and non-binary people in sport and physical activity. Not so much from a sort of wading into the debate over elite level athletes type way, but really about promoting grassroots level access for everybody. And I think that's where I'd like to see more of the conversation focused, because it's where the vast majority of the people who are actually affected are.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah. And I think the thing that I find really kind of interesting about that is that we're always talking about the elite level, but that conversation must have a devastating effect when you see the tone of it on young trans people or just ordinary non-elite, people who just want to get into sports. Has that been your experience of that?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, we see it all the time at GI. And even outside the anecdotal, we've got the stats to back it up. There's an organization in the US called the Trevor Project who conducted an enormous survey of the mental health and well-being of LGBT young people, and found that the way that their lives, the barriers to them, whether they can do sports, whether they can participate in one part or another of society, the way that that's discussed and debated has an immensely negative impact on their mental health. They're now doing the same research in Europe, as a matter of fact, and we've been supporting them with that. And yeah, we see it in our young people. We see it in their families. There's a sense in which this arguing back and forth of who counts as a woman for the purpose of swimming, cycling, running, who is allowed to play on what team. The fact that trans women are under this constant scrutiny and threat of exclusion, and on the other hand, everyone else under the trans umbrella is completely forgotten when it comes to where they can play and how. It all trickles down to our young people, and yeah, it has a serious impact on their mental health, and also it ends up with schools being confused about how to include trans students, and so not including them at all. It ends with people being turned away from local five-a-sides. And that's where the really serious impact is this exclusion that happens early and at a local level and can really lock you out of sport.
And are those, is that exclusion, I guess it's both, but is it through kind of rules of sports clubs, or is it kind of more a kind of social thing amongst peer groups that they kind of feel like they don't fit in? Because I think I'm thinking about my son, but I guess certainly with football, which would be a major one that they're wanting to kind of streamline groups, then even from like age 7 or something, then it's boys and girls separated.
It's a great question, really, because it's sort of one informing the other. In the UK at the moment, we're in a particularly volatile moment for regulations and guidelines being set by sports governing bodies. We've recently seen changes of policy, sometimes quite dramatic changes of policy, from cycling, from tennis, from rugby. And these are following pressure from groups that we are part of, what we call the anti-gender movement, but I think that's a bit jargony. So it's sort of groups that advocate for more heavily gendered separation or more heavily separated genders in general, and specifically for the exclusion of trans people and intersex people, but also from people like the former Minister for Digital Culture, Media and Sport, Nadine Dorries, advocated strongly for British sports governing bodies to adopt a harsher policy towards excluding trans athletes. And while these policies often take quite specific and technical terms, there are as yet relatively few blanket bans on trans athletes, and more sort of restrictive policies on things like testosterone levels, sort of when an athlete begins medical transition, for instance, or to what extent they've had medical transition. But that minutiae, as it applies to elite sport, tends to trickle down into schools, into casual play, into grassroots sport in the form of broad generalizations about trans people. And that's when you have, non-binary people being excluded from casual women's leagues, for instance, when it comes to football. This was quite a serious problem among some London-based leagues last year, where some leagues or some teams in a league supported the inclusion of non-binary players. Some teams in the league did not. And the judges made recourse to laws that had been recently introduced to restrict trans players participating at an elite level. And so what happens is that the regulations and the policies that are introduced to restrict play at an elite level become the culture and the social restrictions more broadly. And of course, the worst thing about it is that the levels of play where social exclusion is happening are the ones where things like body type make the least difference. If you're looking at elite football, and you've got a group of 22 players, they're at the top of their game, they're in peak physical condition, then very, very slight variations in that might make a significant difference, right? That's without wanting to wade into the argument around it, that's at least sounds plausible. But if you join a local league, you are going to have an enormous diversity of age ranges, an enormous diversity of body types, fitness levels. I've been down to the local kickabout a couple of times, and you've got guys there who are in the gym benching 240 every single day, and you've got like 60-year-old women who are there before they go and pick up the grandkids from school.
And all of them would be better than me.
Yeah. Oh, well.
You know what I mean? Like, every single one of them would kick my ass.
100%.
Yeah, there's a reason I don't spend a lot of time down at the five-a-side. those 60-year-old women just keep handing my ass to me. But and I guess that's, it's obviously there's a hypocrisy in this, because obviously what underwrites a lot of these policies is the political exclusion of trans people rather than a sincere consideration of fairness or safety in sport. But yeah, it completely ignores the fact, even like excludes the fact that sub-elite sport has always been about diversity and about open participation.
Yeah, I'd love to see how you kind of, at GI kind of do speak into that, and kind of what kind of advice you give people. Is there ever any kind of phase at which, at like level of sport, like elite sport, that there is a place with some kind of restrictions on who can take part? Or is it just kind of, should it be kind of anyone who wants to be in their kind of particular kind of area should be free to be part of that?
It's honestly not something I have the expertise to speak to, but so there's almost two issues here. One of which is the problem isn't that we need to sort of figure out whether or not it's beneficial or okay to exclude transgender athletes from elite sport in one way or another. The problem is that the way that those conversations are being had is leading to a much larger exclusion of transgender people from any kind of sport and physical activity. And I think what we really want to do is reframe the conversation. And that's certainly the advice that we've given, as with the guidance that we've supported the Northern Ireland Human Rights Campaign to develop. The focus is much more on how we can include people who are marginalized in sport at all other levels, rather than sort of wading into the argument about elite sport. And the other point is that the restrictions that we have implemented to exclude transgender athletes from elite sport have excluded almost no transgender athletes, but they have excluded lots and lots of people who aren't transgender athletes. For instance, I can maybe think of Emily Bridges, the British cyclist, who's been excluded from competing in the women's category by British Cycling, owing to fairly recent policy changes. But she's the only person I can call to mind easily. But if you look at the number of athletes, and particularly Black women, who are excluded because their testosterone levels are outside the norm, or who even aren't excluded but are just sort of targeted with this almost conspiratorial mindset, it sort of becomes apparent that even if you can make the best case in the world for excluding, let's say, trans women from competitive athletics or from the women's category of competitive athletics, that the way in which these exclusions have been applied immediately starts to hurt, sure, trans women, but also everyone else who doesn't fit an increasingly narrow physical norm. It's quite often in this conversation, and I'll only touch on it lightly because I don't really like to get into the debate, but Michael Phelps, the swimmer, quite often gets brought up because, of course, he's an incredible swimmer with an incredible career, but he has a number of genetic and physiological differences that make him particularly well suited to swimming.
Yeah.
Like substantially better than a lot of his competitors. But of course, because we don't view that kind of physical difference in the same way that we view something like being transgender or being intersex, there would never be a thought of excluding him from the sport because of his competitive advantage. And I think that's the line that is now being crossed quite dramatically when it comes to the exclusion of trans athletes, where the rules that are being used to try and exclude trans athletes are excluding lots of people who aren't trans. They are just naturally good at their sport. And yeah, as I say, it's telling the kind of bodies that these rules are sorting for in sport, where you look at how many people who are being either targeted or excluded are Black female athletes.
And that's something that you see in when it comes to kind of the inclusion of trans people. It's something that goes beyond sport in some ways that is just ridiculous. I remember like a while ago, I think it was the organization that runs the Women's March, that they changed their logo to have, because I think it's kind of women's faces in profile, and they changed their logo so that one of the women's noses was like just a slightly more kind of pronounced nose, essentially like my nose, as you would see it here. And there was people attacking it, being like, well, you've tried to include like trans women in this thing. This isn't like, how dare you try and include this thing? And I was like, that's my nose. Like, what
I'm sorry,
done.
there are masculine noses?
Oh, like I was like, what you have now done is just shamed other people for their natural body type. It's like, it's beyond belief.
No, absolutely. It's completely wild. And I think that's sort of what underlies a lot of these trans exclusionary arguments, is a move towards separating masculinity and femininity and putting these things in more defined categories, you know, like working against a lot of the achievements that have been made, not just for trans people or even for queer people, but for women, for instance, you know, feminist achievements that have been made over the past 50, 60, 70 years to break down those barriers. I think it's a real testament, the fact that when I grew up, which was also under Section 28 in the UK, boys couldn't play netball, girls couldn't play football. That was just the way things were. That was the way that sports worked. And now, you know, we have like the England women's team are significantly more popular at home and around the world than our men's team. There's a huge culture of women's football going all the way down to an early age, but via the issue of trans people being included in sport, I've seen politicians, like media mouthpieces, calling for sports in schools to be resegregated, you know, for boys' sports and girls' sports to return, because of this idea that, you know, if a boy plays netball, then it's taking something away from girls, as if, like you say, masculinity and femininity are these clearly defined sets of features and bodies that we mustn't allow to mix. And so, yeah, it's quite scary, I think, when simultaneously seeing how far we've come since I was a kid and how regressive some of the arguments are becoming.
I mean, wasn't there a case quite recently of a cis woman getting assaulted because she went into a woman's bathroom? I feel like I'm going to say an article, but obviously that's a lie. It was a TikTok about that happening. And because of exactly this, of like these weird hyper feminized, hyper masculine kind of ideas of what constitutes a woman or a man. Like, do you see that kind of more broadly than just sport? This segregation of men and women?
I think certainly it's something that we are seeing more of in the UK, but that we see a lot of in the US. Ever since the conversation around these so-called bathroom bills, sort of like attempts to legislate which gendered spaces trans people can and can't access, began, I suppose, in force in the US over the past 5 to 10 years. Of course, it's been happening for a while longer than that, but I suppose this current fever for it has sprung up in the past 5 to 10 years in the US. And time again, you see butch lesbians or even just, like straight cis women with short hair and jeans being escorted out of women's bathrooms or attacked because they're believed to be trans. And while, there's just so much to talk about in terms of the way that this, like you say, segregation of masculinity and femininity is a goal of conservative movements more broadly, the way that it's fed by narratives that come from the media and from the government. And I don't know if we've got time to get into any of that, but certainly exclusion from sport is part of that, because it's a way of, I suppose, at its very, very basic level, saying which bodies are okay and which bodies aren't.
This may be kind of tangential to what we've kind of been talking about. It's not really about the sports questions, but while we're talking about kind of masculinity, femininity, I just love to speak to you, Cleo, about how kind of you relate to femininity and how that kind of features part of your identity. Because I'm as a cis woman who, I was growing up, definitely was I didn't allow myself to kind of be feminine in a lot of ways because of kind of the boxes I put myself in and the ways that I found myself, having being able to kind of in my early 20s / mid to late 20s be able to kind of reconnect with my femininity in a way I think has felt for me like a super liberating experience. And for that to be my experience as a cis woman, I feel like that must be kind of a wildly different and wildly kind of maybe more intense, I don't know, for you as a trans woman. So I'd love to know your thoughts on that.
Great question. Massive question.
Yes.
How long have you?
How long do we have?
I was going to say.
It's supposed to be stupid questions, not huge questions. Come on.
The new Judith Butler book coming out next year. Can we wait for that? No. It's possible you're actually asking the wrong trans woman, because I've been out for donkey's years, and I sort of came out the womb in a pride flag in a lot of ways, and sort of like when I learned about what being gay was, then I was gay, and then a couple of years later learned about what transgender was and was like, oh no, it's this one or it's both. And so but there was never a sort of big turning point or anything. I always was what I am, just didn't necessarily always have the words for it. And part of that was growing up under Section 28, right? Because it was illegal to teach kids the words for it. And so it's not like I don't think I've actually had any revelatory experiences of femininity per se, except actually perhaps in the context of faith, which I'm conscious we've not really touched on, but maybe we can touch on in a bit. I would say probably my experience has been similar to yours and similar to what lots of women in their 20s go through. And perhaps just sharpened by the fact of having a trans woman's self-consciousness about the way that I'm perceived and sort of read by others. Where in my late teens, early 90s, in my late teens, early 20s.
You're looking great for
I'll never drop the skincare routine. In my late teens, early 20s, I was much more, I guess, aggressively feminine part of which came out of a sort of anxiety about making sure people knew who I was. And then I think as I've got a bit older, got a bit more comfortable in myself, just kind of chilled out a bit in that really nice way you can do when you hit your 30s, and you can do the fun stuff you were doing in your 20s, but without worrying about your identity all the time. I've become less concerned about that. But like I say, while I'm sure that there are elements of that experience that are like sharpened or highlighted by being trans, I think it's probably an experience that most young women have in one way or another.
I'm super interested in that kind of experience of masculinity and femininity and how those things express, as much as you can reduce anything to that, and you know, the kind of stereotypes there within the trans community. Like, are there divisions around like people who are trans women who like to appear butch at times? Is there a tension? I mean, I don't think you can ever talk about any community as a homogenous whole, but like, is that, I just find that interesting, because it would occur to me quite a lot, and even does as a cis man. Yeah.
I think, as with any, I mean, you've almost answered the question by talking about the trouble of this using community to homogenize like a vast and diverse group of people with radically different experiences and identities, and ways of being. You know, there will always be the odd few social media soapboxers who will go to bat for whether trans men or trans women or non-binary people have it worse, or whether you can be trans if you don't feel bad about your body, or whether you can be a trans man and still be feminine, or a trans woman and still be masculine. But I think that's honestly just like part of what comes with any community, and also with social media, that there will always be that kind of thing. And I think the vast majority of people recognize that, as with any group of people, regardless of gender identity, there's like a hugely diverse range of expressions. You know, being a trans woman isn't tied to being feminine any more than being a woman full stop is tied to being feminine. And so, yeah, I think within the trans community, there's the same range of and enthusiasm for a range of gender expressions as there is a range of gender identities.
I guess I kind of always have this hope that there will be some kind of community or group somewhere where people are generally kinder to each other about these things. Do you know what I mean? Like, that's just...
Yeah. I mean, me too. No. I think for the most part, we are kind to each other. I think it's always, I think if we're being real, it's a hard time for trans people in the UK right now. It's probably going to get harder over the next couple of years. And hard times grind people down. They make us bitter. You know, I find that I have less patience, less energy than I did 5 years ago, which is possibly also because I'm 5 years older. But, you know, that things outside have gotten chillier. And it makes it easier to, I guess, snipe at each other or pick at each other in online spaces or in community spaces, particularly when there's so much else around you that you can't control. And so I think it's really important in times like this to always be reminding ourselves to be kind to each other and to care for each other, and to not let celebrating our differences separate us because of them. But having said all of that in a very sort of high-minded and noble way, I do genuinely just think that it is a very loving community, that the queer community always has been pushed together by adversity, and that with that comes an inclination to love each other for our different ways of going through life, even if we don't necessarily understand them. You know, the generation that's coming up beneath us, the generation that's in school now, everything that's coming out of them online in research suggests that they have a way more fluid understanding of gender and sexuality than we do. And I sometimes find that quite hard to get to grips with. As like a trans woman in my mid-30s, I feel like almost the titles of my like gender identity, my sexuality, are things that were really hard won, like things I had to discover when they were hidden and then hold on to and defend. And the idea that, the next generation actually don't care so much about that, about what it all means, I sometimes find a bit hard to get to grips with. But I think that that's just part of the way that these things shift and change over time. And I think that by and large, the community are embracing it, and that we do accept these changes, these different ways of doing things.
When you were talking about the climate getting chillier for trans people in the UK, I was struck speaking to family back home in South Africa last year at the vehemence and aggression of the tone of opposition. It was around a conversation about sport, so maybe that's completely natural to any conversation about sport in South Africa because people are so brutal. But it was much more than that, about a woman who was born intersex and was competing in some kind of sporting thing, and there was racism tied up in that for sure. There was sexism tied up in that for sure. But there was a brutality and aggression that I very rarely hear, except when people are discussing gender binaries or those who don't fit into their gender binaries. Do you have a sense of why it's so aggressive, and how does that affect you personally? Because it's not just a kind of people are talking about you in a fairly clinical way, which would be bad enough, but there's this, I don't know, there's this hate that I mean, that would be devastating to me.
So I think, yeah, so I mean, it's horrible. It's really horrible. And I really feel for everyone who's affected by it. I think what's important to remember is that no one is naturally hateful towards trans people, towards anyone. And even those of us who grow up in societies that are exclusionary, discriminatory, the vast majority of people aren't hateful. Even now, in the midst of quite a sustained campaign of exclusion against transgender people in the UK, the vast majority of people don't oppose rights for transgender people, don't oppose inclusion for trans people. Honestly, the vast majority of people don't care, which is perhaps the ideal. But I think where this really vicious language comes from is from the newspapers, from the headlines, from social media, and from the government. We've seen in the past year in the UK, US style language around calling trans people groomers, talk of transing children, of like sexual predators being allowed into women's spaces. All of this is thrown around casually and of course baselessly, but it almost doesn't matter that it's baseless because it's thrown around casually in the media and in political discussions at the highest level of government with such frequency. Last year there was 7,500 articles written in the mainstream UK press about trans people, and the overwhelming majority of those are hostile. That language becomes the language that these conversations are had in. And I think that's what starts to, I don't really know what the word is here. I was going to say radicalize, but that's such a loaded word. That's what affects the tone of these conversations. I think there's a tendency to perceive people who say men shouldn't be allowed to steal medals from women or something about transgender women in sport. It's easy to perceive people who say that as being specifically hateful, like saying that because they particularly hate transgender people, or they're saying that because, they particularly believe that transgender people should be excluded. But I think the vast majority of people who you know, I think it's important to remember that behind these kinds of comments, behind these kinds of conversations, is this huge pressure that's coming out from the media, that's coming out from the social media, the press, the things that people see and engage with every single day. I think it actually makes it all the more important to keep having reasonably calm, like sensible conversations about what trans people in sport actually looks like, which is your friends, neighbors, colleagues, schoolmates doing sports with you. Because I think most people who are saying these, like quite hateful things aren't actually saying them because they hate transgender people. Yeah. They're saying them because they've spent the past 5 years exposed to constant hateful language and rhetoric towards transgender people.
And it's a great way for people who have a political agenda to use the media and social media to create wedge issues so that people are not talking about, inequality or capitalism's, destructive effect on the planet or any of that sort of stuff, I guess.
Yeah, absolutely. We are experiencing a cost of living crisis in the UK. Our economy is in shambles. Our healthcare system is on the verge of collapse. And the leaders of both our main political parties are engaged in a kind of race to the bottom on migration, on trans issues, on anything remotely connected to social justice. In the case of the ruling party, to distract from what is now like a powerful, almost preposterous legacy of failures. Like they've been in government 13 years, and it's still impressive how bad it's been. But also, when we talk about the government, we're not really talking about one party or another, because it's endemic. There seems to be this situation where there's almost a competition to see who can push trans people or refugees or disabled people under the bus the hardest to distract from any of the serious and bigger conversations.
It just feels like 1930s fascism just starting up all over. It's so fucking depressing. Okay, wait. Let's. I realize I'm taking us down an incredibly dark path. Stay. It's going to get cool. Hey, what are we drinking? That's a fine question. That's a fine. Laura, what are you drinking?
I'm back on the old faithful. I need to stop saying that I've got no alcohol in the house, because in reality I have so much Jack Daniels. So I'm gonna drink it all.
Lying about how much alcohol is in your room is a bad sign. People generally say, just putting it out there.
Yeah. But I have Jack Daniels and Coke is what I have with. Yeah.
Malky, what about you?
I am drinking. I feel like I'm getting predictable as well. Brooklyn Brewery. That's very good to say, isn't it? Brooklyn Brewery.
If you're Scottish.
Special effects. Yeah.
Wait, I'll go more South African. Brooklyn Brewery. Yes, like.
I can't do that. I feel excluded.
Man, you're from Crawley. You should be able to say it.
Oh, mate.
Nice. Cleo, what about you?
I'm not drinking 1930s fascism. I have I've got a chamomile tea because I know I feel like it's quite boring, actually. I considered going and getting a glass of whiskey, but A, I'm technically on the clock, and B, even if I, regardless of whether I
hasn't drunk on the clock. Let's be
well, even, regardless of whether I'm on the clock now, I'm also on the clock tomorrow morning, and I also have to go to the dentist tomorrow morning. So chamomile tea for me, extremely calm, extremely happy.
I have also been admiring your mug from. It's very cute.
Oh wait,
thank you. My girlfriend got it for me. Hold on, let me hold that up to the camera. It says "Create Change."
Oh, that's lovely.
As if I went closer to the mic.
Okay, that gives me
camera.
The mic.
I'm falling apart.
That's enough booze for you.
Yeah.
Okay, you showed your mug. Now I can show you. I made this mug. Laura and I were at a pottery painting thing, and I love it so much that I'm drinking beer from it.
It's gorgeous.
I like it so much, and I am drinking Candy Kittens, Raspberry and Guava New England IPA, which I'm sure my dad would be proud of. We should probably get on to the faith question. Malky, you're Scottish.
You're a Christian.
Well, I want to shamelessly steal. There's another great progressive podcast, and they always kick off by asking their guests, I'm going to screw it up, tell us about the faith you inherited.
Ooh, the faith you inherited.
Yeah.
Wow.
Did you even inherit one?
I did actually, yeah. So funnily enough, it does kind of dovetail with queerness in that I inherited quite so I was raised Christian, but a sort of loose, low church. Well, I want to say happy clappy Church of England faith. Our local church sort of had the vibes of like the kind of Southern Baptist churches that you see on TV, except everyone is white and 65 years old. But it was really homophobic, really Islamophobic. And for a combination of these reasons and the fact that when I was about 10 years old, I decided that I was too smart for the teachings of Jesus, checked out and had a militant atheist phase that lasted into my 20s. And then, yeah, as with so many other things in my 20s, kind of chilled out and started rethinking the situation. And then via a friend, ended up coming back into the church I have now, which I can go on and talk about if you like.
Malky, you have a follow-up there, Malk, or you?
On a message, and I got totally distracted.
Jonty just asked me for a time check, but I just put loads of moisturizer on my hand.
I was just like, you're doing this the whole time, and I'm like, what is happening?
Like, oh no.
Turn your camera off. What's that?
Sorry.
Is there a traditional follow-up to the faith you inherited, Malky?
I don't know. I never get past that.
I never listened to somebody else's podcast. And I was like, well, then I can follow up by saying, and now, like, how would you describe your faith?
I would say I'm an Anglican, but like
that could mean anything.
Yeah, well, super high church Anglican. So I say this, and if anybody somehow implausibly from St. John's Timber Hill in Norwich is listening to this and disagrees with what I'm about to say, then you have my apologies. I'll say a Hail Mary. My Anglican church is the least Church of England Anglican church I've ever been to. Like, the rite is entirely Catholic. Whenever the king gets a mention in the prayers, it's almost in sort of subdued tones, and then we hurry on to get to the Pope as quickly as possible. And I have a sort of hypothetical reason for this that I've only ever had half confirmed, where my parish it has sort of two claims to fame, one of which is has the church of Julian of Norwich, the Christian mystic who's sort of like massively influential on medieval Christian theology, and particularly around the idea that God is love. And two, it's become a kind of catchment zone over the past 50 years for gay Catholics who can't find acceptance in the Catholic Church and have come for the next best thing.
Anglicanism is the next best thing to Catholicism. That's great.
Well, yeah, because we have a massive Catholic cathedral in Norwich, but they aren't amazing on gay people. And my church, although Anglican, were you not aware that it was Anglican, you would easily believe it was Catholic. And I have this really strong belief that the reason for that is that everyone there, more or less, does want it to be Catholic. And it's just full of kind of gay Catholic refugees.
That's fantastic.
Yeah, priests included,
Love it. That's so cool. So
yeah.
So the vibe there is I mean, because I always think, so I come from a non-church background, and then came into it via kind of very Southern Baptist fundamentalist church in South Africa. So my picture of high Anglicanism is always very subdued and very kind of controlled and all that kind of stuff. Is that the vibe?
I suppose it depends on what you mean by subdued. The energy of the congregation, I would say, is quieter compared to a Baptist church, but the energy in the right is no less intense. I think there's a real sense of, how do I want to say this? It's very intensely invested with the spirituality of the whole process of congregation and communion. There's like an extraordinary sincerity to it, which I think I was, when I contrast it to the church services I went to in my youth, which had, like multiple electric guitars, but also these quite long sermons that touched less on, what Christianity teaches and more on, why we should donate to one fund or another to get Muslims out of the UK or something. This church, I found a real sincerity there, which, although I think might come across as subdued, has like a very rich and powerful core. Does that make sense?
Yeah, it does. And can I also ask, was it kind of finding that, which came first really? Was it finding the community that was accepting, or was it a kind of internal journey of faith and then trying to, I don't know, get over stumbling blocks?
It was a bit of both, actually. Oh God, how long ago now? 6 or 7 years ago, I became friends with someone who's now one of my very closest friends, one of my great loves, Annie, if you're listening to this, hi. And she's Catholic, and we spent a lot of time, particularly in 2017 and 18, but a lot of time in general, going to parties and then sitting up all night, getting into deep and meaningful conversations about God. And it was through those conversations, and particularly through her persistent advocacy for God being love and God having love for everyone, regardless of their journey or who they are, that I started to reconsider my own journey back into the faith. And I think that commenced a journey of a few years, sort of where I tried a few churches, and that's so weird. I've just got a little push notification show that she's texting me. There we go.
No.
God moves in mysterious ways.
Wow.
Anyway.
Checkmate, atheists.
Yeah, checkmate, atheists.
That's it. We're done. That's all we need.
Yeah, cut. No, I sort of went to a few churches and sort of strayed between the more socially liberal churches, also not having as, I don't want to say as serious a worship or as serious a ritual as I wanted, because that feels like an unfair criticism, but having a much looser approach to Christian worship than I was looking for. I think I'm a big believer in ritual and the idea there's something almost magical in it. And then the more, the Catholic Church, which is, of course, the one with all the smells and bells, being significantly more socially conservative. And then eventually, a friend tipped me off that St. John's had services for the masses for the LGBT community and kept the parish, the city's World AIDS Day book. And I sort of went along one day and have never looked back.
Beautiful. Love that. How do you find that your kind of queer identity and your faith identity kind of meld together, and especially in the kind of wider kind of community sense? Because I think we see, kind of understandably, from a lot of kind of people in the queer community at the moment, a lot of kind of art and things particularly are kind of going on quite, strongly anti-Christian sentiment as a response to how they've been treated by the church. So like in a way that is, kind of respectable and understandable in a lot of ways. How do you feel like your kind of Christian identity fits in with that?
Yeah, it's a great question, and one that I'm not entirely qualified to answer. But yeah, I think both within non-queer faith communities and non-faith queer communities, this idea that there's a divide or a conflict between being queer and having faith sometimes gets exaggerated. And I've been guilty of that in the past. Like I said, when I had my sort of militant online atheist phase, I really went to bat for the idea that finding who I was as a queer person had enlightened me about sort of the lie of religion. But actually, I think the more that I've sort of like got to know both of these communities, the more I've found that faith communities are full of people who are queer and queer communities are full of people who are faith. It's just often quite hard for those people to talk about it because of this lasting idea that there's a divide. And as you say, because of the fact that this divide does, in some communities, come from, religious policymakers like the Synod, like the highest levels of the Catholic Church, who do set out discriminatory or exclusionary rhetorics and policies, even though many of these don't filter down to your local church. But acknowledging the fact that, the Pope, for instance, hasn't always been the number one guy when it comes to trans inclusion, although actually literally today, I think he took a promising step towards improvement there. I've never really found anything but joy in the navigation of my queer identity and my faith identity, because I think they are, they're one and the same thing. I always think of the bit in Paul's first letter to the Corinthians. I felt like I should be able to tell you where it is because it's a bloody long letter, but somewhere in there. Read the whole thing. It's good for you.
Yeah, you have to read it. It's fine.
Yeah. That's your homework. He talks about the interdependency of the parts of the body and the fact that the foot can't declare itself not to be a foot, or rather it could declare itself not to be a foot, but it would still be part of the body. The hand can't do the job of the eye or the eye of the hand, and they can't do their jobs without each other. And he even talks about, like the parts of the body that we cover up, that we treat as shameful, are the parts of the body that we take the most special care of. And it's always really spoken to me, like obviously it literally is an allegory for the church, but as a particular way of thinking about queer communities and faith communities together, because there are times when we sort of declare ourselves apart from one community or another, or, attempt to cut ourselves off in one way or another. But I don't think there are queer communities without faith communities anywhere, any more than you can have faith communities without queer communities. They're completely interdependent, and often it's the parts of those communities that we've taken great pains to hide or to exclude or to cut off in the past that need the greatest care and the most sort of maintenance. And I think I've just really come to understand that and feel that very fully in the reconciliation of queer identity and faith.
Yeah, I'm so glad that you mentioned that that's something that's brought you joy, because it gives us an excellent segue. Because something we wanted to ask you, just because I think having listened to some of your in preparation, having listened to some of the other podcasts that you've done, and listened to some other kind of interviews with other trans women, I was really struck with the idea that we need to be having some time to celebrate trans joy, because we've hit you with some pretty hard questions, and we are it's, as we said, it's looking pretty chilly out there. So what is something that you have thought has brought you joy?
Great question. I think first of all, I'm just going to do a bit of a disclaimer in that while I am really glad for any joy and benefits it brings people, I have a personal bugbear with this hashtag trans joy.
Oh no.
No. I think
it's you, Laura.
And here's why you're wrong. Cancelled. No. I think it's really important to take the time to highlight what's joyful. I suppose there's it's almost become within the trans community for me a new sort of love is love, a sort of like slightly, how am I going to say this without coming across as just like the most bitter and jaded person?
So we're all bitter and jaded here. So go for it.
No. Joy. I suppose what I'm getting at is, because it's such a difficult time, there's almost been this backlash to the backlash, this push to say like, oh, we need to be telling optimistic stories, we need to be telling hopeful stories. And I think like hashtag trans joy for me has become representative of maybe a drive to almost like a drive to make ourselves be happy, to make ourselves be joyful in a difficult time. When I think what I really want for storytelling, for like trans storytelling, is for us to be able to talk honestly and authentically about the fact that things are bad if things are bad, and to be able to talk within that about the things that still bring us succor or calm or soothing. But I can also talk about joy.
Write your own story, Cleo.
You
should.
don't,
Direct the narrative.
Don't let this cis woman bully you. Okay, like you do you know?
So, I mean, faith is a big one, right? And I think that is also quite illustrative of that the long and winding point that I've just tried to make, that quite often when I'm in mass or when I'm praying, I'm not like feeling sort of full of fizzy energy like I would be if I was kicking in the door at the party of the century, which I will be doing at Norwich Pride this weekend. But it is often a kind of balm for the aches and pains that I think anyone accrues if you know, like you said earlier, like you hear hateful things, you see them in the news, you see people in your community or around you suffering. And so it's not a joy in the sense of an increase of happiness per se, but it is a joy in the sense of like a tonic for sorrows. And then outside of that, I genuinely do think that it is worth like ending on the fact that, you know, I have my local pride this weekend and all of my friends are going to be there, because that is the most reliable source of joy to me. Like whenever there's like a particularly bad week at work, or there's something horrendous in the news, or I hear something from in the US or from somewhere else in the world that makes me really shudder about where the UK is going, I can be like reliably set upright again by being in a room with just like more than, let's say, 5, 6 gay people and jumping up and down a bit. Like perhaps I'm just a simple woman of simple pleasures, but that is like a literally never fail source of joy to me.
To be fair, that would be a source of joy to me, and I'm a relatively straight cis guy, so I don't know. That's like that sounds great. Is there anything that Christians who are not trans could do to make things better?
Do you mean within the church or more generally?
I mean everything. I mean in the church, I mean outside the church, I mean in their interactions with you. What can we do better?
A general rule for both, I think, is to not be afraid to stand up and to not be afraid to get it wrong. You know, I mentioned earlier that the vast majority of people don't hate trans people, but also the vast majority of people aren't standing up for trans people. And I think that's where we just have like a real loss of political capital, like a real loss of power, because we're a tiny minority, or rather, we're in this awkward position where there are loads of us, numerically speaking, but we're a tiny fraction of the population. You know, there's hundreds of thousands of trans people in the UK. That's still only 0.5% of the UK. And so it's relatively easy to silence us, to suppress us. So what really makes a difference is whether it's if you see someone being hassled on the street, on the bus, on the train, whether you hear someone saying something hateful at home or in the workplace, being able to step in and say, I really don't think that's on. You know, it doesn't have to be a debate. You don't have to bring like flashcards to have these conversations. It can just be as simple as saying, I'm really not okay with that. And then when I say being okay to get it wrong, time and time again, what we hear from our trainers and from our educators is that people really want to get involved in conversations about trans issues, and they really want to help their trans colleagues or friends be included, but they just don't know how to talk about it. They're worried about getting the wrong pronoun. They're worried about saying the wrong word. They're worried about calling me Chloe instead of Cleo.
Fuck! You could have let me get away with it. But no, yeah. No, but
Never
legitimately,
forget,
you don't want to be a douchebag. You don't want to be, because there's so many fucking douchebags about this. You don't want to be one of them.
Yeah, totally. And the thing is, I get it because like I am a trans woman. I've been one my whole life, and I've been a professional trans woman, I suppose, for nearly 3 years. And I still get it wrong sometimes, right? Like what's so important is if you get it wrong, if you get the wrong pronoun, if you use the wrong word and someone says, "Oh, I'm not cool with that." Even if they get angry about it, because sometimes people do get angry, people are tired, just saying like, "Oh, I'm really sorry, I won't do it again," and move on. Because the worst situation is when you have trans people who are on edge because they don't know how someone's going to address them, and cis people who are on edge because they don't know how to talk to trans people. Nobody's talking to each other. And meanwhile, this very, very small minority who do hate trans people and who do want to erode not just our rights and protections, but the rights and protections of women, intersex people, all sorts of groups, continue to advance their agenda. I think it's so simple, but, if you're worried about trans people being included in your church, then invite trans people to come to mass or invite trans people to come to whatever congregation you hold. And if there's a problem, don't be afraid to speak up about it. Of course, it won't always be that easy. Of course, sometimes it is just a difficult world, but the vast majority of the time, like 99% of the time, it is that easy.
And that feels like a real sad, a success for the tabloids, for the bad guys putting out that narrative. When you all these numerous negative articles that you referenced earlier, they will cherry pick in a very Daily Mail way, like, the worst fringe comments out of context to make it seem like someone was cancelled and didn't have a career anymore because they accidentally got a pronoun wrong. And that builds into that fear, doesn't it?
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, it just fuels the idea that trans people are sort of like lying in wait like a trapdoor spider, where they're ready to sort of jump out on the first perceived slight. And what, to wrap back around to what people can do, really just being normal and normalizing, recognizing that trans people aren't really substantially different from anyone else in any way besides maybe gender identity, and that in every other way, we are your neighbors, your fellow congregants, your family members. And that once you recognize that, it becomes so, so easy to accept trans people, whether it's into your church, into, your local sports club. One of the things that always strikes me is that one of the strongest indicators of whether or not someone is accepting of queer people is whether or not they have a queer relative. And this holds true across the political spectrum. It's not a left-wing, right-wing thing. You can have people who are really conservative almost across the board, but will go to bat for trans rights or for gay rights because they know someone and they love someone who is queer. And I think it's once you can have these conversations, once you can see trans people not as a set of issues to be discussed, but as people, that's when you can start making change in your local communities.
Because if you see people as issues, then you won't be the kind of person who will say, "Oh, sorry, I got that wrong. I won't do it again. It wasn't from malice, it was from ignorance." And that can be applied to any group that is trying to get liberation. Like white people could learn from that, and, straight people can learn from that, and men could certainly fucking learn from that. And there's a lot going on there. We're running quite long, but I have just realized that I forgot to ask you one of the things that I was most interested in, which was, you're a historian and a historiographer, is that right? Am I using the right academic term? Now yes. I'm worried about that term. Excellent. So there's this narrative in the kind of right-wing press that says, "Oh, this is a fad, this is a new thing, people are suddenly being pressured because it's fashionable, la la la." Can you talk to us about people who are outside of this rigid gender binary in sports and in society generally, or in society generally, if we're bored with the sports thing now, and historical precedents?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I can sort of talk about both. So you're absolutely right that there is a really pernicious narrative going around at the moment, that more and more young people are coming out as trans in one way or another, you know, whether that's trans or non-binary or gender fluid, because it's a fad. And while there are more people who are openly transgender now than there have been, let's say, 50 years ago, I think what's really important to understand is that the way that people express their gender and their sexuality has always varied over time and has always been subject to the society of the time. You know, there are two things that are abundantly, uncontestably true about history, which is that there have always been people who have gone through their life being more or less at peace with their gender being the same as their sex at birth, and people who, in one way or another, have gone through life having their gender be different to their sex at birth. And the other thing is that these people have been regarded and have expressed themselves and been accepted or not accepted to whatever degree in radically different ways, depending on what period in time they're living, where in the world they're living, what their culture is. And so the idea of saying that being trans is a fad, I mean, of course, it's, you know, it's a bad faith argument in the first place, but it's also just a completely insincere way of thinking about history. You know, we might look to indigenous groups, many indigenous groups in Oceania, in North America, who have long cultural histories of third genders or fluid understanding of genders that are preserved as parts of the traditions of these cultures. But even if we look back through history in Europe, we see that the further back we go, the less men and women are distinguished in terms of dress, the less men and women are distinguished in terms of social roles. And that actually, without wanting to go into too much historical detail when we're already running long, things like binary gender and specific social roles for men and specific social roles for women and absolutely nothing in between are relatively recent inventions in the scale of human life. Prior to the 16th century in England, there's no state law that regulates homosexuality. Of course, there's a long history of difficult relations between queer people, as we understand them now, and the church. But prior to that, it's not something that the government regulates. This is actually something that has increased with time, the attempts of states to regulate who you can love, who you can sleep with, how you can express yourself. And a great deal of it, you know, we think of decriminalizing homosexuality, for instance, or allowing equal marriage as like big, progressive and uniquely modern steps, when actually what we're really doing is undoing historical precedents that we set as part of an ongoing project to regulate and restrict who gets to be who gets to be with who. And in terms of how that applies to sport, that is more of a modern history. I suppose the situation we're currently in probably has its roots in Renee Richards, who's an American tennis player in, I want to say, the 1970s. And she is playing a couple of years of sort of, I think, mid-range competitive tennis as a man, and then retires, transitions, and re-enters playing women's tennis under a new name. And she has sort of middling success, but then is outed by almost implausibly Tucker Carlson's dad, who is, right?
That's insane.
It's totally mad. Who is, I suppose, the Tucker Carlson of his day. And it causes a huge scandal. And they introduce chromosome typing for the first time. And of course, there's no sort of proof of this, like, her public life is as the woman that she is. And she takes the test, and of all things, the results come back. It's sort of indeterminate, but of course, by this point, the story is too much, and she leaves tennis. She sues the tennis federation, and the court finds in favor of her that she is a woman, that she should be allowed to play tennis as a woman, and that the testing shouldn't be used. And so the first standard that gets set for trans inclusion or exclusion in sport, even at a fairly competitive level of the sport, says really, really clearly, look, you're clearly a woman. You're entitled to the access and rights of a woman. It is fundamentally a human rights matter, and that has been impinged here. And we've got from there, I suppose we've enjoyed since then, a period of liberality, but one that's just not really ever been tested because so few trans people are in elite sport that it's essentially a zero-sum game, or it has been in many ways. And now we found ourselves returning to this same, I suppose, sort of hawkish monitoring of athletes to check their testosterone levels, to check their birth sex in a way that's moving further and further away from the human rights-based judgment that was handed down the first time that this became an issue in modern history. And so, yeah, I think it's important to put it in context that, again, we're not looking at a history where trans people have been habitually or traditionally excluded from sport, and that the policy changes that are happening now are part of that, so much as quite a sharp turn towards unprecedentedly exclusionary measures.
And that's part more of that shift of fascism in the right that was just so depressing we had to start drinking. So yeah, let's not promote that unhealthy stuff anymore. I think that's been brilliant. It's been amazing to talk to you. Where can people find out more about gendered intelligence, and is there anything that you would like people to read or watch or engage with further?
So you can find the best information about us on our website, which is genderedintelligence.co.uk. You can also find us on Twitter, or X now, I suppose, although I'm never going to stop saying Twitter, I imagine.
Yeah, don't give in. It's still Twitter.
It's still Twitter. As a media professional, it's going to be Twitter in my heart.
Absolutely.
No, you can find us on Twitter, Instagram, and Facebook, where we've got information about our services. So we do youth groups, including online youth groups for trans and gender questioning young people in the UK. We also have a support line for trans people, and that focuses specifically on people who are on waiting lists for gender identity services. The details for all of that are on our website as well, so please do get in touch. Otherwise, I think that is everything.
Brilliant. Cleo, thank you so much for joining us. If you are listening to Beer Christianity for the first time and you'd like to find more of our stuff, you can find us at beerchristianity.co.uk. You can get in touch with us, Beer Christianity, on Insta, also on Twitter, never calling it X. And you can email us, beerchristianity@yahoo.com. Do get in touch. And thanks. Oh, thanks to, is it Michael? Michael bought a shirt. Merch.
Hey.
Cleo, we have merch and somebody bought some. And not for the first time. It's frankly, very encouraging. It's unnerving. I feel very uncomfortable. Thanks so much for being with us, and enjoy Norwich Pride.
Thanks so much. It's been a real pleasure.
And thanks for listening. Bye.
Bye.
Bye.